You already know how this story ends. The fire, the flames against the night sky over Alexandria, smoke rising from the greatest collection of knowledge the ancient world had ever assembled. Hundreds of thousands of scrolls, the works of Aristotle, the lost plays of Sophocles, medical texts, mathematical discoveries, philosophical traditions, all of it consumed in a single catastrophic night. You know the image. You can probably picture it. There's just one problem. It didn't happen that way. Not because there was no fire. There were fires, several of them, across several centuries. But the Library of Alexandria did not die in a night. It died slowly, quietly, over hundreds of years, not in a roar of flames, but in the way that almost everything important is lost, through neglect, through underfunding, through the slow, invisible decision made again and again by people who should have known better, that other things were more urgent right now. And that story, the real story, is considerably more frightening than the one you were told. Let's start with what the library actually was, because the image most people carry, a single grand building full of scrolls, is already wrong. The Library of Alexandria was not one building. It was an institution, a complex of structures clustered together in the royal quarter of the city, attached to a larger institution called the Mausean, the place of the Muses, something closer to what we would now call a research university. At its height, it employed scholars from across the known world. It didn't simply collect books. It actively hunted for them. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbor were searched, and any scrolls found on board were confiscated and copied. The copies were returned to the owners. The originals were kept. Scholars were housed, fed, and paid a salary to do nothing but think and write and argue. Euclid worked here. Archimedes is believed to have studied here. Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the earth to within a startling degree of accuracy, served as its chief librarian. The numbers are disputed, as ancient numbers always are, but estimates of the collection range from several 100,000 to perhaps 700,000 scrolls at its peak. This was not a library in any sense you would recognize from your daily life. It was the closest thing the ancient world produced to an attempt to contain all human knowledge in one place. So when was it destroyed? This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. The honest answer is that historians cannot agree, because there was no single night. There was no single fire. A scholar named Luciano Canfora, who spent decades investigating the question, described the destruction of the library not as an event, but as a process, a centuries-long accumulation of damage, neglect, and loss. Here is what actually happened, or what we know, which is not quite the same thing. In 48 BC, Julius Caesar found himself trapped in Alexandria during a civil war. He set fire to ships in the harbor to prevent them from being used against him. The fire spread to the docks. Some ancient sources mention books being burned, but the question of whether this reached the library itself, and which part of it, is genuinely uncertain. Most historians who have examined the evidence closely believe that what burned, if anything, was a warehouse near the docks that stored books awaiting export, not the main collection. Later, in the 3rd century AD, the Emperor Aurelian put down a revolt in Alexandria and destroyed much of the royal quarter where parts of the library complex stood. How much of the collection survived this is unclear. In 391 AD, the Christian bishop Theophilus ordered the destruction of the Serapeum, a temple that housed what is sometimes called the daughter library, a collection in a different part of the city. This was real, documented, a genuine loss. And then there is the story most popularly told today, that the Arab general Amr ibn Alas, upon conquering Alexandria in 642 AD, burned whatever remained on the orders of the Caliph Omar, supposedly saying that books agreeing with the Quran were redundant and books disagreeing with it were dangerous. It is a vivid story. It is also, according to most modern historians, almost certainly a much later invention. The earliest sources that tell it appear centuries after the fact, and by 642, the question of what remained to burn is itself very much open. An Egyptian historian named Mostafa el-Abadi spent years reconstructing the evidence for what actually happened to the library across these centuries. What he found was a picture quite different from the dramatic narrative of sudden destruction. The library had been declining long before any of these events, not catastrophically, quietly. The royal funding that had sustained it began to shrink as the Ptolemaic dynasty that founded it weakened. New rulers had different priorities. The scholar salaries fell. The book-hunting expeditions stopped. The copying slowed. And there was a problem that no fire ever caused. Papyrus decays. The scrolls the library held were not made of stone or metal, or anything built to last centuries. They were made of pressed reeds, fragile, vulnerable to moisture, to insects, to the simple passage of time. A scroll that was not recopied, when it began to deteriorate, was a scroll that was eventually lost, not burned, not stolen, simply allowed to become unreadable. A historian named Edward Parsons, who wrote one of the earliest detailed accounts of the Alexandrian library in the 20th century, estimated that even without any fires or conquests, the natural decay of papyrus would have destroyed much of any ancient collection within a few centuries, unless an active, funded, determined effort was made to recopy every scroll before it fell apart. That effort required money and attention and the political will to treat the preservation of knowledge as a priority. And at some point, that will ran out. Here is the question that the real history of the Library of Alexandria forces you to sit with. If the library had burned in a single night, the story would be a tragedy, a fire, a villain, a moment of irreversible catastrophe. And tragedies, however terrible, are at least clean. They have a cause, a date, a person to blame. But the library didn't burn in a single night. It deteriorated across centuries. It lost funding in budget cycles. It lost scholars to cities that paid better. It lost scrolls to damp and insects, and the perfectly ordinary passage of time, because not enough people in positions of power ever decided that recopying them was worth the expense. There was no single catastrophic decision. There were 1,000 small ones, 1,000 moments where someone said, "Not this year. We have other priorities that can wait." And knowledge, it turns out, does not wait. It simply disappears at approximately the speed of neglect. What survived? Fragments, copies of copies made before the originals were lost, works preserved in other cities, other traditions, other hands. We know what Euclid wrote because Arabic scholars translated and preserved his geometry when much of Western Europe had lost access to it. We know what Aristotle argued because monks in cold scriptoria copied his works by hand across centuries when nobody in power thought it urgent. The knowledge that survived the ancient world did not survive because anyone protected it heroically. It survived because enough individual people in enough scattered places thought it was worth their time to copy one more page before the candle went out. Think about what that means for the story you were told. We want the library to have burned in a night because that story gives the loss a shape, a villain, a date, a clear moment when something ended. The real story gives us none of those comforts. It gives us a process so slow it was nearly invisible to the people living through it. A decline nobody declared, nobody announced, nobody quite noticed until it was irreversibly complete. And that is not an ancient problem. Every archive that loses its funding, every language that has only a handful of fluent speakers left, every set of skills that a generation carries and never quite passes on, every library whose roof leaks and whose repair budget is cut for the 7th consecutive year. None of those end in a fire. They end in the way the Library of Alexandria ended, not with a catastrophe, but with a quiet morning when someone goes to find a thing that used to be there and discovers that it isn't anymore and cannot quite say when it stopped being there or who exactly made the decision to let it go. So go back to the image you had. The fire, the night sky over Alexandria, the smoke. It's a powerful image. It makes a kind of sense. But the library didn't look like that at the end. At the end, it probably looked like a room with fewer people in it than there used to be. Shelves with gaps where scrolls had been. A budget that hadn't kept up with what needed doing. It looked, in other words, like 1,000 ordinary institutions that we watch decline without quite registering what we're watching. The fire is easier to mourn, but the slow forgetting is the thing that actually happened, and the slow forgetting is the thing, if we are not careful, that always happens, not because anyone chose it, because not enough people chose against it.